Today I'm joined by the creator of hardcore single-player survival game Road to Vostok. We dig into how devs could approach getting a job in the industry in 2024 and beyond, how you can maximize the potential of the project you're working on, his title, and a whole lot more. Buckle up, let's get into it.
You've worked AAA, you've worked indie, you know the industry. So with that in mind, when you look at how games have evolved over the last couple of years, how they've changed. So as you look at the definitions of these two different types of studios and the opportunities that they have, what do you think the outlook is going to be for indie games as a whole in the next 5 years? Are they going to be even more truncated by AAA and by big budgets and by AI? Or is this a time for them to thrive where they will have more visibility?
Games nowadays are really complicated and expensive products in many ways. It's related to graphics improving. Even though we have all these new tools and game development should always become more easier and easier, it's actually in many cases the opposite way. It's good that big studios are pushing the envelope, but at the same time the productions are getting more and more complicated because people are interested in photorealism and getting the next gen experience, and that's a bit unfortunate because that usually leads to unfinished projects and stuff that is delayed. So indies doesn't have this issue of pushing the envelope in many sense. So it's okay for us to do not the most polished experiences in some sense. So indies can compete in multiple ways when it comes to development cycles. I definitely see that indie studios are going to be more and more appreciated in the near future, and I think it's already started to show. It's also related to this bridge between the players and the studios. Usually the bridge is smaller with the indies and larger with the big guys. So one of the practical examples, if I could give, is that I'm currently running an indie studio, and usually the advertisers and the the marketing money is pushed towards the big guys.
Yeah.
So indies have worked with themselves. But personally, I have seen more and more new collaborations with for example, last year I did some collaboration deals with Finnish weapon manufacturers, and many of the sponsors and collaboration efforts are now available also for indies because the big guys are not interested anymore of that side of monetization. They are more interested in a live service, microtransaction and so on. And there's nothing wrong with it. But I do see that indies will have more opportunities to fund their current games than maybe previously. And it might be tied to this two different camps. I don't like to consider that there's two different camps of studios, but there's definitely more opportunities and more doors to open for indies nowadays. I think the indies are going to have really bright future.
I guess with that same line of thought, right, with the opportunity aspect of the industry, AI is a big part of that industry right now. Is AI going to have a negative effect or a positive effect on PC-driven, mainly indie-driven games? And obviously that's a broad question, but do you see it giving more opportunity or less opportunity?
I think the first element to this question is that many people are considering that we are going to have AI-made complete games in the near future. I'm pretty confident to say that even I'm not fully dive into AI development, but I know game development enough that making tailored, optimized and viable game products, we are quite far away that AI can make those. AI is struggling with many, even with the basic 3D tasks. So it's quite a big leap. This will take many years because before that will happen, meaning there's an enjoyable AI-made game on the market. But when it comes to AI-driven tools, that's whole another ballgame because those have already sneak into modern game engines. Unity is starting to implement those, and I think Unreal is also working with some of those, but they are usually quite specific. In my view, the AI hasn't fully yet even arrived to this industry as a game developer. I don't see any real useful tools. Maybe there's some Photoshop generative fill stuff that could be used on textures, but in a daily basis, daily workhorse tool, I don't currently use any AI tools. I have tried some, but there haven't been any that would be super useful yet. I'm old school guy in a way that I really believe that there's still some nuance to handmade stuff, and in games they are so complicated products in a whole that if you combine multiple AI elements together, usually the end result is not coherent and there's this it feels like AI made. It's hard to explain. I'm pretty sure that in the future AI will come into game industry more and more, but currently it's not a daily thing that I I would use.
From my understanding, from the research I did on this game, you're making this game, and then once it's launched, you are supporting this game. And that's kind of the longevity of this studio, essentially. That's something that is extremely unique for this game. It is something that is, I would say, from a marketing perspective, is extremely difficult with how short attention spans are for players. And so as you develop this game, right, as you look towards long-term playability, how do you approach that?
I think one of the problems with the current game industry and most of the kind of like games that I would like to see happening is that game studios are naturally cyclic, meaning they make a game, they support it, then they make another game, and it's kind of like this, there's a frequency, and you're constantly making new stuff, but you're not kind of like extending the old stuff to its maximum potential, if you know what I mean. When I decided to make the game, the first thing that I decided this is going to be a career, meaning it's not just about the game, it's kind of like building a whole brand. Because for me as player, I really like to have a game that I could see that this is not going disappearing. I think having this kind of like career-long vision for this game is kind of like required, because I've been quite clear about this from the beginning that I'm trying to build the world's best hardcore single-player survival game, and that kind of claim requires years and years of dedication. So it can't be made in a way that you support the game few years and then you are making another game, because then you are not maximizing its potential. And in terms of how the longevity happens in terms of funding and stuff, it's kind of like nuanced topic, but I have tried to keep the production cost so minimal that even a mediocre success at the first early access launch is enough for me to kind of like continue that longevity. Because like I mentioned earlier, one of the key issues that modern games are super expensive to make. It's related to kind of like a high fidelity graphics and the level of polish. So I have tried to stick with this art style and vision that is relatively cheap to make. So I don't require huge amount of cash flow to keep the studio running. So it's all about choices and how you kind of like manage your development cost. I think one aspect that really helped me is that I have been part of this genre, this niche of hardcore survival games from the very beginning. And since then, I've been part of this community and as a passionate player, so I know quite well what kind of game would be appealing to this audience. And many consider that this genre is filled with perfect products already. It actually isn't. If you consider realistic hardcore survival shooter without fantasy elements and no zombies and nothing, there's actually quite a few candidates. There's not that much competition that people think in terms of realistic survival games. I'm trying to build a game that I would like to play as a player, and I know that there's a lot of people like me who would like to see kind of like the Stalker franchise in a realistic way in a single player format, and I think I can provide something unique with the setting that I'm trying to achieve. So I'm trying to fill this niche in this sub-genre of survival games.
I have to circle back because I look at all the studios that are firing these massive amounts of developers right now. And as somebody who, you taught game developers, you see them going into the markets, you see them going into these studios, maybe you don't have any specific insight on why this is happening, but from a game development standpoint, from as these developers are looking for work, what do you think is the best way for them to approach the industry nowadays?
One of the most common mistakes is that most game dev students that apply for a job in the industry, they are kind of shooting to the moon at first with their student portfolios, meaning most of the game studios that they seem exciting are game studios that are not looking a student in their kind of like workforce. So most of those big studios are focusing on hiring senior level game developers. And that's totally understandable, but most students won't recognize that. So you kind of have to climb the ladder. For example, being a contractor, freelancer at your first job is really kind of like easy to secure, because, for example, when I hire contractors, there's minimal risk involved compared to full-time hiring. So I can make risky decisions and try to kind of like gamble on a person. Those are more easy to secure at the first. Then you can build up your portfolio slowly over time. But at first you don't apply with your student portfolio, because let's consider that you are one of the hiring people in a big studio. You get hundreds of same kind of student portfolios every year and nothing stands out. So you can't really compete in those scenarios. If you're looking at the smaller studio, I would highly recommend that when you are sending your resumes, you put effort into analyzing what the studio does. For example, if I would get 10 resumes from 10 different character artists, if one of those artists investigated my project and kind of like analyzed my art style and already made some small prototype based on that art style, that's kind of like the automatic reinsurance to me that I don't have to worry about if this guy understands and this workflow. Yeah. So kind of like spending the hours before and trying to analyze what the studio does. So it's not efficient just to shoot those resumes blindly to multiple studios. They have to be dedicated in some ways.
Looking at your game on the micro scale, right? Looking at specifically your title, the gameplay, just the story behind it, all of those really key elements within this game, right? Talk to me about what players can expect with this title and kind of what this title is all about.
I think there's a missing product in this category that combines really these hardcore elements in a single player format, uses kind of like unique IRL abandoned locations and a stalker themed game without fantasy elements, and combining this hybrid genre, kind of like mixing stuff with the RPG. I think there's room for that, and players who are looking into this game, I think kind of like the realism is one key element. I'm a former army lieutenant. I try to keep things when it comes to weapon handling, kind of like survival and protection and armor systems and looting. I try to keep things as realistic as possible, and also many games really like to have this hand-holding type of experience where many things are kind of like made to make stuff easier. In Road to Vostok, when you use bolt action shotgun, you have to pull back the bolt action. That's a manual thing. You have to insert the cartridges manually by pressing the left mouse button. That's one manual action. You have to close the bolt manually. You have to pump the shotguns manually. So I think there's room for this type of survival game that does as little as hand-holding and automation as possible, and you are kind of like giving you the full control. And also one thing, many survival games are tied to kind of like this prepper culture, meaning there's this post-apocalyptic theme, but I think many survival games are missing that actual key point of prepper culture, which is kind of like stockpiling your items in your hideouts or shelters. They have some maybe container system or something, but in Road to Vostok you can actually place your individual items wherever you want, and you can make those stockpiles to your shelter yourself. So there's a lot of those nuanced little details, and then when you look at the big picture, I think one of the key appealing points in this game is going to be that border zone dangerous journey ideology, where you have multiple, around 20 different maps, multiple crossing points with each having its own separate game mechanics, and you are doing these loot runs to a kind of like mysterious permanent area. That's one of the key points that I really try to emphasize, that there's this fear when you cross that border. I think there's really hard to make that kind of like feel of being afraid of dying in video games and single player games. I think one of the best ways is that permanent element when it's executed correctly, and I truly believe that I can deliver that experience, that gear fear and that hardcore nature through this game. But it will take some years to get it right, but I think that's going to be one of the key elements. There's currently a demos available on Steam, more than I think the current player count for those demos have been almost over 500,000 demo players so far, and it's really obvious to see in the demo what's missing, because single player games need to be replayable, because there's not that online interaction happening, and even that is currently missing in those is the replayability. That's not the content that's tied to AI behavior and all kinds of randomness. So people, when they play this recent demo, are going to see that, okay, this will probably take at least a year when it's in a state that it can bring something unique to the genre, but the core mechanics are already there, so it's progressing nicely, but there's still work to do.